Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Boy, that quietened the room real fast. Thank you for being here. This is a really exciting panel for all of us because the topic of mental health issues are not really discussed very often. It's talked a lot in outside, in the media. Workplaces talk about it. The topic of mental health has become more comfortable for people to talk about, but it's really not a discussion that we have as lawyers, mediators, arbitrators, negotiators. It's just not really discussed. It's kind of it's kind of an unspoken topic. So I'm really thrilled that we have today 4 expert, experienced, well-spoken, well-thought-out people who can really share some valuable insights and strategies with you. And my hope is that by the time you'll have a deeper understanding of what mental health issues are about, how they show up, that you can use when you face someone who might be how to deal with it as a professional, how to deal with it at the table, how to deal with it in negotiations. That is my hope, that you'll come away with some greater understanding, respect, patience. So we are together for until 12 o'clock. And so this is generally how the next hour and a half will go. I will introduce each of the panelists. They'll each have a few minutes to talk about actually what mental health is, because when we talk about mental health issues, every single one of us has a different thought in our mind of what that actually means, from simply feeling blue to having a psychotic break, and everything in between. So we're going to talk about what that actually means. And then we're going to talk about, I'm going to get all of them to discuss what their experiences are with how it shows up at the mediation table, what it actually looks like, what some of the ethical issues are, what some of their experiences are, what some of their case studies are. And then we're going to talk about what happens to we professionals when we deal with it on a regular basis, because we all experience it. There's burnout, there's vicarious trauma, there's a series of fallouts that we experience in working with people who have challenges on a regular basis. And then we're going to close by each one taking a few minutes to talk about what their specific strategies are. And so that will be the last half an hour, and that will be the time when you can probably take a lot of notes and hear what their strategies are in day-to-day work. All right, and hopefully there will be time for Q&A at the end. But certainly if there's not time for Q&A, so that's the plan. And if there's not time for Q&A, then we will certainly be around to answer any other questions after the session. All right, so let us begin with Jessyca Greenwood. So Jessyca Greenwood is a practicing defense lawyer operating from her own practice, which specializes in representing clients involved in complex litigation, mental health issues, and special needs. She's a board member of the Criminal Lawyers Association, where she co-chairs 2 committees, one on mental health and one on women's committee, and is actively involved in mentoring and supervising law students in various initiatives. Jessyca also assists on several other boards and committees and appears regularly as a guest lecturer. So welcome, Jessyca. Jared Norton is a clinician in private practice, providing counseling, family mediation, parenting coordination, and assessment for high-conflict families experiencing separation and divorce. He's also an associate at Riverdale Mediation, a roster mediator with Mediate 393, and serves on the clinical panel with the Office of the Children's Lawyer. Welcome, Jared. These are experienced people, huh? So Lisa Feldstein is an adjunct professor at York University and a health lawyer in private practice with a focus on family health law. She provides advice to family caregivers about mental health law and substitute decision-making. Lisa is previously seconded to the Center for Addiction and Mental Health and taught negotiation at Osgoode Hall Law School for 6 years. Welcome, Lisa. And last but not least, certainly is Gary Furlong, who is a principal with Agreed Dispute Resolution, and has extensive experience in mediation training, alternative dispute resolution, organizational facilitation, negotiation, and conflict resolution. He specializes in intervening in difficult organizational and workplace disputes. So welcome all. So let us begin. If we can begin with Jessyca, and just give us your kind of 2-minute approach to what, in your view, is mental health. When you think about mental health issues, what does that actually mean for you?
Sure. So mental health issues can affect your clients in a wide variety of ways. It can be anything from anxiety to paranoia to not trusting their advocate, their lawyer, the people at the table. So all of those things can factor into your relationship with your client and also your client's interaction with the justice system in the process. One of the most important things I think that you can do is to manage your client's expectations and explain to them how the process is going to unfold. And for us who do this every day, we're sort of immune to the stress, and we know what's going to happen. We know where we need to stand and what we need to say when and what order it's going to go in. But for the clients, it can often be really anxiety-provoking to have to go through this process. And the other thing we have to remember is how we talk about our clients, both amongst ourselves, our colleagues, and to the other side. And we have to make sure that we're respecting them and whatever issues they may have. So we don't refer to our client as a schizophrenic. Our client suffers from schizophrenia. They are not their illness. They are not their difficulty, right? We want to respect them and try to approach their case with a client-centered approach.
Great, thank you. That's such a key piece. They are not their illness. Right, thank you. Just to make a point of that comment, I heard a great phrase that said, labels are for cans, not for people. So, yeah, thank you. Okay.
So when I sort of think of mental health, I sort of see it as a broad spectrum of mental wellness. I sort of see it as, everything from positive mental health, positive mental wellness on a spectrum up to sort of mental health issues, and where you might see sort of pathological issues and mental illness. For me, I locate us all on that spectrum, and I think that it sort of shifts. It's a fluid sort of living, breathing thing, often on a minute-to-minute basis. So as Suzanne said, it's sort of that everything in between. In a mediation context, we see these sort of emotions and behaviors which may indicate certain mental health issues. I try to avoid sort of an over-reliance on what I would call sort of psychodiagnostic criteria. And certainly I think in some contexts professionals overly rely on that. Sort of the flavor right now, of course, is personality disorders. And if you talk to certain people, everyone is either narcissistic or borderline. That's not really helpful. You really have to understand what that means and how it represents, rather than just sort of painting a wide brush and saying all these people have problems. So I think you have to approach it a little bit more creatively and look at things. I mean, I often look at things such as working memory and stress, which are all on that spectrum of mental wellness. And that, as I think as we'll see and we'll talk about a little bit later on, in terms of strategies and things to look out for, those are the types of things that I like to take a really good look at, is people's capacity, not just a label or an idea of what a mental health issue might be, but how it's actually impacting them and their ability to negotiate.
Great, thank you.
So I certainly agree mental health is very broad, and it's so broad that I agree labels are not helpful, and I'll try to illustrate what I mean by that. A lot of my clients are family caregivers, so I do have some clients who come to me, and they're the ones with the mental health issue, but often my clients are the family caregivers trying to seek guardianship for a loved one or get their loved one into a psychiatric facility to get help, that sort of thing. And a common complaint is, my loved one doesn't have a diagnosis. What are these psychiatrists doing? And, they've been in the system for years. And the reality is, a working diagnosis is very common, or no diagnosis, because it's an art as much as it's a science. A lot of illnesses don't have a specific blood test. So the need to label, which often people do quickly feel they need to label, even the professionals aren't always giving out the labels anyway. And even if there is a diagnosis, not every illness manifests in the same way. So just this week, a client of mine, her child has borderline personality disorder, and she was grateful that of the different kinds of symptoms or characteristics her daughter might have, that hers goes towards being withdrawn versus anger. Other people with this exact same disorder can become angry and potentially violent. So same disorder, but manifests very differently. So the label itself isn't necessarily helpful. So I would encourage everyone to really focus more on what are the needs of the person and less about the labels anyway. And the other point I wanted to make is separating intelligence from mental health. They are completely separate concepts. Sometimes people will actually try to say, but she's really smart, and sort of explain. And I say, I know, like, we don't have to assume that because someone has a mental health issue, they're not intelligent. In fact, a number of people that I've seen, they're very intelligent, university educated, and that's actually can be some of the most challenging people, because my clients, the ones who are family members, struggle getting that person help because they're manipulative and they know what to say to their doctor. So I think it's really just important to remember that their intelligence and mental health are completely distinct concepts, and nobody is immune from suffering from a mental health issue.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yeah, this is, I think this is the single biggest emerging area that we have to pay attention to. And when I look at this from a mediation point of view, we get people, generally speaking, for very small slices of time in their lives. And we have a tendency, as you guys have noted, to go toward labels, or on the high end toward the issue of capacity, which I think is, in a sense, the easiest thing to deal with. If someone really doesn't have capacity, that's a completely different issue, and not common that we would get someone who on that day truly lacks capacity. The issue is this continuum or spectrum of behaviors that impact people's ability to make decisions, to process information, and for us as mediators to help them kind of achieve the goals that they're there to try and achieve. So I echo what the diagnosis doesn't help. We all like to diagnose things, and unlike even Jared, I think you are a clinician. I'm not, so I'm very careful not to even let diagnosis come into my head. The question is, how is this person behaving, and at what point does their behavior start to impact or make it very hard to understand what their behaviors are leading to or where they're trying to go? And in that context, mental health and the mental processes people use, we have to have a way to work with and address, or we're just going to be kind of pounding square pegs into round holes as we try and help people reach a resolution or a settlement on something.
Thank you, Gary. Yeah, so we're 10 minutes in, and already there's a lot of enlightenment here, because as you can see, everyone comes at it in a slightly different way with slightly different insights. So some key pieces that I just want to highlight here. Lisa made a really great point to separate people's mental state from their intelligence. It has nothing to do with the other. And we sometimes forget when we are working with people or faced with people who have behavioral challenges or whose behaviors don't seem to fit into our expectations of normalcy or of appropriateness. All of our unconscious biases jump in. We begin to make judgments notwithstanding we're professionals and we're supposed to be above it. The fact is that we're human, each and every one of us, so we do. And that's what happens to us. The more experience we have with it, obviously, the less we'll slip into that, but it does happen. So that's why the more we become aware of it, and the more we become aware of how this affects us, the better. And so as we move forward, I just actually offer you, invite you into a challenge at this moment to listen. As we're listening to this, I invite you to listen with your own conscious awareness and maybe begin to question the kinds of behaviors and challenges that trigger you. I know when Jared was talking, and he was talking about labels, and he talked about narcissism. You know, narcissism is sort of one of the very public words that are thrown around. There's articles on it. There's discussions, and you know, people will always say in their family, "Oh my God, I have such a narcissistic person in my family," or whatever. People throw that word around a lot. So there's a difference between what we generally think of and what clinically it is. But I invite you to just be mindful of what triggers you, and then you will listen with an awareness with some insight, some greater insight when we come to the strategies around that. Okay. So let's move into some discussion here. And so I'd like to pose to all of you the question of how this really shows up at the mediation table. So there are, as we've talked about, a variety of different behaviors. And I invite you to, maybe beginning with Gary, to talk about what some of your experiences have been in how different behaviors show up at the mediation table.
So I try and think of these things really practically. So generally speaking, when I'm working with clients, I kind of view all of us, myself included, we're all kind of black boxes, where we show up, we don't know what makes this person tick, we know what they're saying, their behaviors don't always match what they're saying. You add into that this idea of stress, pressure, and conflict. It changes how people behave and how their words and actions and decisions and how they talk about an issue are processed and come out. And so I sort of view this as how do we connect with people to understand some of the alignment between what they say they want, what their behaviors are doing to either further or reduce the chances of them getting what they want, how they perceive that, and try and keep connecting sort of layer by layer into that as much as I can in what makes sense to them. And there comes a point usually where we all have our own experience in life where I will be working with somebody, and up to a certain point, it kind of makes sense. Like you can see how what they're saying and what they're then doing and or offering or suggesting is in some broad alignment. When I start to code that there may be mental health issues is when that gets significantly out of alignment. When what they're saying does not match what they then want to do, how much they can maintain a train of thought or a purposeful direction toward getting some of their goals and objectives met. And then stay as close to that as possible. So I had a very senior manager at a Crown corporation who had 3 or 4 harassment complaints lodged against him, and they decided to mediate it, and it started with me meeting with him. And it went down very quickly the direction of he had decided and to your point, very bright guy. Like this guy had charts and arrows and had worked this out and obviously spent tens of hours figuring out just how persecuted he was. That everything in the system was designed, not just happening, but designed to get him out of the organization. Wow. And watching that, as you go through that, his goals and objectives of staying in that organization, of being successful, which he said were completely undermined by this very broad set of behaviors and this point of view in the world. And the best I could do was stay as close as I could to that, continually ask him, talk to him, help him try and answer for me how he saw that meeting his goals and objectives. And in this particular case, there was really, the world he lived in was too contained, too sealed, for him to even decide what he was going to do. Needless to say, there was absolutely, I pulled the plug on joint sessions because there was literally no way that in talking to him, and he agreed, that anything in a joint session could change his perspective on any of this. And when I had the conversation about how this may be something that is significantly impairing him from getting what he wanted, it drew, of course, a great deal of, he was quite upset that there wasn't, that I couldn't see the world his way. On the one hand, he'd say, of course there's other ways to see the world, and of course there's only one way to see it in this case. And none of those incongruities in this particular case changed anything that we could do. And when I suggested that this, really wasn't appropriate to take forward, he was actually in quite complete agreement with it. We unfortunately left with him not having any, in his own world, any idea of how to move it forward to get anything that he wanted. And at the end of the day, not long after, he ended up simply leaving the organization because, maybe partly because of our discussion, mostly I think because of his charts and graphs, it all pointed to him not being successful there. And he decided that it was just best if he left. But it was interesting, from that there was no way to help this individual, in this case, connect his own goals, objectives with his behaviors, and it made him quite frustrated as well. He was also in that category convinced that there was absolutely nothing wrong with him or his point of view. So it can be quite frustrating to work in those circumstances, but at the end of the day, since this person clearly had capacity and was clearly a bright guy in his life, very functional, that at the end of the day it was his to manage, and our time together was really just focused at trying to find a way to bring some alignment to all of that, and not always successful in this particular case.
So that's a great example, Gary, and what I can draw from that is that sometimes people's reality is their reality that they are stuck in, entrenched in. And we may not be successful at moving them out of that reality, which may not gel with our own or everyone else's at the table. But what we can do is we can make that experience as positive as possible for them so that at least they feel respected and valued. And the outcome may not be, certainly in this case it wasn't, it didn't move things forward in a way that we wanted it to, but at least his experience was positive.
Well, I hesitate only around the word positive. I don't think he would
describe it as that. Or at least not conflictual.
Yeah, and I think that it's still constructive, though. Right. Because what I felt I was doing was participating in trying to jointly construct some other options and ways forward with him, which he participated in fully to the extent that I think he kept running into that one particular wall, that if you made the deep assumption that everything was out to get me, then it's hard to get past that one, because we all know the phrase, believing is seeing. Well, it's the reverse that's true. Once you believe something, it's what you tend to see. But it was still a process of jointly working to construct some other ways forward that he was participated in very much, however frustrating. And I personally think it contributed to his decision to not stay, fight, dig his heels in, wait to get terminated, that he decided that there wasn't a pathway there for him, any way that he could see that made sense. And at the end of the day, it was what it was.
Right, okay, thank you. Jessyca.
So 2 points to follow up on from that is sometimes your client or the person that you're working with is going to have very little insight about their mental illness, and it may or may not be to your advantage to try to work through that with them. If there is a real delusion or psychosis or illness, and so sometimes I don't bring it to the client's attention. I don't focus on that. I try to work through what the legal issue is, give them their options, and treat them like any other client. And the rules of professional conduct for lawyers actually say that you are to treat a client in a normal lawyer-client relationship, despite any disability or mental health issue that they may have, if they have capacity. Now, if they don't have capacity, that's a different issue, and you may need to engage other professionals like the public guardian and trustee. But otherwise, I think that you do have to try to keep the relationship as normal as possible, and don't impose what you feel is in the client's best interest and try to force them to take that path if that may not be what they want. And in my practice, in my experience, I've had a lot of clients who have told me that the government implanted some kind of listening device into their brain and is listening to everything they say, and this is all a big setup, and they want to have a trial to expose the injustice of what's happening to them. And I say, well, unfortunately, your DNA is at the crime scene, and there's fingerprints, and it's an overwhelming case against you. And it doesn't matter. I have to follow their instructions and have a trial. And judges know what that means when I have to run a trial like that, and I do the very best I can. And in some cases I am successful, and some I'm not. But no matter what, I have to give the client the best advocacy that I have in me and defend their case. And if I can't do that, then I probably shouldn't be their lawyer. So 2 things, think about the level of insight that the client has and don't impose your views on them. Try to listen to what their views are, and sometimes that means that they may be doing something that isn't in their best interest. But if those are your instructions, I think that's what you have to move forward with, and make sure that you get all of your instructions in writing if it's something that isn't in the client's interest. I see a hand.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, I like what you're saying is, I think one of the challenging things in working with folks when that's a struggle is we all have in ourselves the desire to be useful, like to accomplish our objective.
Just for the people that are watching by webcast, I'll just repeat that. So what is being said is that we want to be helpful or useful to our clients.
And then if we aren't successful for whatever reason, a lack of insight, for instance, I think a lot of times what you say is, I'm not communicating this right, or there's something I'm not doing that causes the person not to see what I think is evident. And I think that's what sometimes causes difficulty in the working relationship, because that's what it is. It's a working relationship.
Right.
Because I think it causes us to feel insufficient.
Right.
And then it's very difficult to maintain that sense of balance, as Jerry's sort of describing it. Being able to be okay with the fact that you can't achieve your objective for them.
Right. So being okay with the fact that you can't achieve the objective for the client and sort of feeling insufficient. And I think all of that is very normal. But at the end of the day, we have to remember it's about the client and it's about their experience and not our experience. And sometimes that can be really difficult, and especially in my world, in the criminal justice system, which is highly adversarial, it's not fun to lose. It's not fun to go in front of a jury and argue a case where you know that you're going to be annihilated. That's not fun for me, but I do it anyways because I believe deeply in the client's right to a fair trial and to have a vigorous and zealous advocate on their side, and I do it anyways, but it's not fun.
Just a quick follow-up. I think that's one of the differences when we talk mediation and advocacy, and I agree with everything you're saying on advocacy. As a mediator, it's certainly not my job to impose anything on the client. It is my job to challenge them. It is my job to try and cause them to see it, think differently, assess it differently. And I think when we cross the line from the normal range, to use the wrong word, of course, but what we all call the normal range of how people behave under stress, pressure, or conflict into what we call mental health issues, then I think that we're still in the business on the mediation side of challenging, questioning that, not imposing. And I think that other than capacity issues, the labels impair our ability to do that. If we're not careful. But we should treat them as normal, to use the word you did, normal clients, in that I challenge all the clients I work with to see the world differently. The question is, do I change my strategies? And we'll get into that when I suspect someone's got a pretty significant, different way of looking at the world that we might call a mental health issue.
Yeah, and just before we move on, I just want to make a couple of comments here. And what you said, Jess, really reminded me of the value of respect and this whole idea of being seen and heard. So when we are faced with someone who has a significantly different approach to reality than ours is, we have to make sure that we don't get into our judgment brain and convince them that they're wrong, but treat them as though their reality is acceptable and not acceptable, but at least acknowledge their reality and allow them to feel that they are heard, that we are listening to them and acknowledging them and respecting them for what they are saying, even if we want to shift them into a different opening of other thoughts. But it's really this concept of respecting, and when someone feels respected, they will feel heard. And so if they don't feel that they're actually getting their point across, if they feel that they're being heard, that will often win the day and shift them. Yeah. All right, Jared.
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of, I guess, continue on that, I mean, absolutely you can respectfully confront someone's reality without discrediting their reality or discrediting their narrative. As Gary said, I mean, absolutely, as a mediator, there is reality testing there. And where there are constructs or where there are certain things like laws, people have to be aware of the facts. And those are realities which are largely inescapable. So you can remind people of that and bring that information to their attention in a respectful way. When we talk about strategies, and I might talk about it a little bit later in terms of motivational interviewing style questions, where you can confront very respectfully and challenge people's sort of views on things, as I said, without discrediting them. Just going back in terms of how mental health sort of reveals itself at the table, sort of along that lines, I work primarily in the family context. And with a lot of sort of mental health issues, and for us in general, we all sort of present with thought distortions. If you talk to people in a custody and access sort of conflict, you hear often two completely opposite representations of a shared reality. One person is saying something that just does not fit with the other. So again, going back, we have to be mindful of how we confront those two different stories and how we try to bring them together to reach a sort of shared resolution. When I mentioned sort of stress and working memory as something I look at, that to me is a way that it shows up all the time. It is stressful for everyone, even those people who sort of have, resiliency and sort of mental wellness. But when you look at mental health issues, anxiety being a big one, the way in which that stress impacts sort of an anxious person or someone who may have anxiety symptomology, the working memory is limited. So they may not be able to hold information. They may not be able to express certain things or think about things at a higher level. So that is obviously going to have an impact on the negotiation and how people interact. It also impacts me as a mediator and how I control the tempo. If someone is unable to process information at the same degree as the other party, and myself aligns with the other party, and we just go full steam ahead, and the other person's getting lost, they start getting overwhelmed, they can process even less and less, eventually that person's going to reach a point of breakdown. And then you often get that sort of glazed look and the nodding head. And unless you check in and sort of keep on top of that, people get lost. And then you're from at least my perspective, the process has been corrupted. I look a lot at emotional regulation, going back to sort of personality disorders. That's a big part of personality disorders. We certainly know a lot now about brain science and sort of left brain, right brain, and why people who may be high conflict or have personality disorders tend to be sort of full throttle in that sort of, fight mode all the time. So I look at emotional regulation. We see a lot of anger, certainly in the family context, uncontrollable anger at times. And when that is mixed with things like thought distortions, it is a sort of toxic combination of things. When people have these incredibly polarized persecutory thoughts and they get really, really angry. The thing that I often talk to mediators about in terms of anger, of course, is that anger itself is often a second or third level emotion. And if we respond solely to the anger, we often miss the boat as well. Just to provide a sort of a brief anecdote to that, I worked with a father who presented as incredibly angry, and it was only after, I guess, sort of a number of meetings with him, an extended sort of intake, that it was sort of, revealed that the underlying cause of that anger was depression. There is a strong comorbidity between depression and anger, specifically in males. Males are typically very bad at expressing deeper level emotions, especially ones which portray them as being vulnerable. So you get anger as the surface emotion. If you structure your process solely to address the anger, you miss the fact that here is someone who could be quite vulnerable and themselves at risk for certain things. In this case, the person eventually revealed that they had some self-harming behavior, but if I had just focused on the anger, I would never have gotten there. So just always, I sort of encourage people to be mindful of going deeper, not taking sort of face behaviors and emotions as the sort of the top level thing to be addressed. Mental health is complex and it's deep. And when we talk about things like differential diagnoses, what presents as one issue is often something else entirely. And that's what makes it so challenging, certainly in a mediation context.
So great, Jared. Thank you. And before we move to Lisa, we'll come to strategies, but you mentioned such a key point of paying attention and getting curious, not judgmental, and not taking emotions and responses at face value. And there is a lot of learning to be done by each of us as a professional to get to that place. So I'll look forward to the strategy place, a time when you can talk about how you address that and how you build that capacity as a professional. Okay, thank you. Lisa.
So I thought I'd follow up on the comments about being detached from reality with some practical things that I've learned. And one of them is somebody may not have insight into their illness or may perceive the world, everybody's out to get them, that sort of thing, but it doesn't mean they're detached from all reality. And it may be that you can actually separate their delusions or their lack of insight from whatever it is that you're actually mediating. If it's an employment matter or something else, you may actually be able to separate. Some people who lack insight, they can still have a job and go about their day and interact with people who would never know they have a mental illness at all. And so you often can separate it, and you don't necessarily have to, although reality checking is part of mediation, you don't necessarily have to reality check a delusion that maybe has nothing to do with why you're at the table. Often you won't be able to convince them. A delusion is, a very deeply held belief that is real to that person. I've received a number of phone calls like Jessyca. Frankly, many of them go nowhere because they're calling me about something that's not truly a legal issue, but they're being followed, they're receiving messages, they had an MRI and now somebody can see through their brain or through their eyes, so things that there's really no legal solution there. But they're very scared, and it's a very real experience for that person. And so I don't try to talk them out of it. I got that advice early on. What I instead often do is point to the lack of evidence to say, I'm very sorry and I'd like to help you, but without any evidence, there's really nothing we could do to persuade a judge that that's happening. There's no document, there's nothing. And so sometimes by citing the lack of evidence, I'm not discounting their reality, but kind of moving past it. So that's sometimes a helpful tool. And also, it's a helpful tool when you're not sure. I've been quite surprised a few times where there's a person with capacity issues, mental health issues. I'm not sure what to believe. Some people tell a story that sounds very true. Maybe they have dementia and it happened a long time ago, or maybe they're oriented to time and place, but it's their perception. And frankly, I don't know what to believe. And so sometimes actually doing the fact checking, you can find out the real answer. So I've actually spoken to somebody's friend from their childhood or other people in their life or seen documents, and to my surprise, the story that this person was telling, and there is, actual paranoia in their life, but the story is true. And that's happened a few times. And that goes back to the point about checking biases, because I've been, able to confirm a number of times stories that I may have discounted to be untrue were in fact true. And as a mediator, that can be hard to do in the moment if you don't have the opportunity to make phone calls or ask people to produce documents. But if you are able to talk about the law in general as an environment where we need evidence, sometimes you can have them maybe go and get documents or reach out to other people to actually confirm before just dismissing something as not true. And so maybe I'll stop there on that point.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Yes. And so when it comes to strategies, we'll talk about how you pay more attention to your unconscious bias and the conclusions that you jump to. So there's lots and lots of stories. I did want to talk about, or invite you to talk about disclosing confidential information and the legalities around that, because there is some contention around when we can disclose, when we can't disclose, and how that actually plays out. And I know, Jess, you had some comments about that as well, stories around that.
Absolutely. So it's a situation where you absolutely have to have a person's consent to disclose their personal health information. And it can become a difficult situation if you want to, you're negotiating with the other side, you want to be able to advise them that there are some mental health issues or that there are issues at play. But you really can't disclose any confidential information about a person without their permission. So I think it's an issue that you should definitely flag. You should consider it, and before disclosing any documents or information sharing about someone's personal health issues, you definitely should have consent, and that should be in writing. I think it's something that everyone has to be aware of, and it's happened to me where the police or the Crown Attorney that I'm dealing with already know that the person is unwell, and they've been apprehended under the Mental Health Act by the police. There's records about that. But then the client thinks that I have disclosed that information and they didn't want me to. And as it turned out, it wasn't the case, but it was very difficult for me to convince the client that I had not disclosed that information and that the other side already knew that information. So it's something to definitely keep in mind and be wary of, because we do have a duty of confidentiality to clients as lawyers, and we can get in trouble if we violate that. So it's something to flag.
Great.
So
Okay.
an interesting question. If you were in a mediation context for a moment, what would you think of counsel disclosing that that's what they're dealing with their client to the mediator within the context of the confidentiality of mediation?
Well, I still think that counsel should have their client's permission to disclose. And there are times where my clients don't want me to share that information, but I take the time to explain to them that I think it would be beneficial for the mediator to have that information. And it's the same for me when I'm trying to negotiate a resolution for my client. I say, I think this is important information for the judge to know, because they're going to be the one sentencing you, and it's very important. And it's no different than your role as the mediator. You're making the decision about the outcome. And so, but I do still think, even with the confidentiality context of mediation, you should have your client's consent. Do you agree?
So, yeah, I mean, obviously the rules of professional conduct we have to follow. One situation that can arise, though, is the helpful family member, and people knowing that their loved one is unwell and maybe needs help or needs an advocate or isn't making decisions that are in their best interest, and the family member wants to help. And that can be a challenge if the person who's the client and at the table doesn't authorize their family. And so sometimes the family members get very frustrated by that. And the system, the family members really do struggle. There are so many barriers. Their health professionals don't want to give them information. They're worried about breaching privacy laws. And all they want to do is help. And they come across so many walls. And yet often it's because the person doesn't consent. So, I mean, one strategy that sometimes is helpful when the family members are trying to be involved and the person hasn't consented is to be helpful without disclosing information about the individual, whether it's about the legal process generally, or for health professionals, they can disclose information about the condition generally. And so try to give the family something to take away that's helpful and not just putting up another wall, but also isn't disclosing information you don't have consent to disclose.
Right, yeah, it's a big topic, yes.
Another question, sort of a follow-up on Gary's question on that. I'd say, so sometimes counsel will say, well, the client's very difficult. And given that, we talk about the continuum of mental health, and like there are days I'm very difficult. and somebody
Here.
representing me would be well advised to say to the other person, this isn't Rick's best day. He's very difficult. And so I often think you don't necessarily have to disclose a diagnosis, for instance.
That's right.
To be able to say, I'm having a hard time getting instructions today, and maybe here's the kind of thing that's more persuasive, here's the kind of thing that's less persuasive, and then say to the mediator, can you find some stuff like this? Because that's kind of what's selling in there, and this stuff you keep bringing to me, that's not selling. You know what I mean? Because I don't think you're disclosing either a diagnosis or specific, but I think all of us can be difficult, right? I don't know. Some
Absolutely.
people even say that's not appropriate for a counsel to admit that their client is difficult.
I disagree. I think that you have to be realistic about what you're dealing with. And I think that if you're in that situation where you're trying to negotiate a resolution as opposed to engage the adversarial process, then the parties have to be aware of what you're dealing with. And I agree with you that that's not disclosing personal health information. It's being realistic.
But just to comment about that word realistic, I think where it comes down to also is what Jared was talking about, is not imposing any biases on that, and Lisa was too, not imposing any biases on that. Be realistic. Say, okay, there's some difficulty. So identify, not this person as being difficult, because that doesn't advance anything or enlighten anything, but there are some difficulties, or we're having difficulties understanding each other, or identify what the difficulties are, not just this person is difficult, because that's yet another label. And, Rick may be difficult on that particular day, but how is Rick being difficult? He's being quick to anger, or he's not listening, or right? So I think that's really what it comes down to, being realistic, but realistic without the judgment, being realistic in a way that enlightens the situation.
And I think most of us are mediators. We don't necessarily want the judgment. It's not necessarily useful to us. What's useful to us is the strategic information around, here's the kind of stuff that my client can hear.
Yes.
Here's the kind of stuff my client can't really hear today.
Right. Exactly. Yes. And being really conscious about how you're speaking, how you're positioning it. If you're speaking too fast, if you're using words that they're not hearing, if they're interpreting it in a judgmental way. Absolutely. So really being mindful of how you're presenting that difficult moment. Yeah, exactly. And that's what all this comes down to. So it doesn't really matter what the issues are if this person is feeling that the world is conspiring in a very systematic way, or if they're just having a down day, or whatever they are in the continuum. It almost doesn't matter. What matters is how we are paying attention to it and the shifts that we are making to be aware of whatever difficulties may become challenges in advancing the process. So it really is about us. It's not about them. It comes down to us and how we handle the situation. Right. I just want to take 1 second here and just give a little story of my own. So I do a lot of workplace presentations and on communication and conflict, and one of the most commonly requested sessions that I give is how to deal with difficult people, right? And so because people come to the session and they always say, I can't believe this person is doing this, and of course they come to the session wanting me to help them deal with that person or change that person, because it's always the other person, when in fact what? We turn it around, and it's never about the person. It's always about what you're bringing to the table. And people always come away saying, really, I can't change them. I have to change myself? Really? And so they get disappointed because that they still have to live with or work with that individual as they are. They have to do the work themselves. And it's sort of the same concept for all of us, that our clients are our clients, and they will have the realities and the behavior that they do. We have to do the work. We have to have the conflict management 101 workshop always in our head to know how to manage that effectively. Yeah.
Can we expand on that idea? Because I think the flip side of it is that a lot of people come to mediation already having made the diagnosis of the other person. So they say,
Yeah.
my husband's narcissistic, or there's boredom, whatever.
Right.
And what are the strategies that because often how the other people judge the person who may have a mental illness exacerbates the mental illness in the
Yes.
process, right? So they're keeping it alive. And I think a lot about education and where does that come into the mediation process, or what else would you suggest when we're not dealing with just one person, we're really dealing with the system. And in the legal context, it's more clear. The boundaries are more clear. In mediation, you really are dealing with people who are coming with already conceived ideas of how crazy the person is, or how 20 years of the difficult relationship they've had,
Right.
whatever.
So I can
What strategy?
I can offer one strategy that I sometimes use is sometimes I just get the client, and it might be more appropriate to do in that case in caucus, but to get the person to focus on the end goal and talk about how inflaming the situation doesn't really get us there. And I know that you feel X is important, but to get there, we don't need to go there. We don't need to address that, use those words, bring whatever it is into it in order to achieve your goal, and sort of validate to the client why it's important to them. But I often say, I use the word inflame a lot in those kinds of discussions, but basically saying bringing that up is only going to inflame things. It will get the person angry. We're going to not use our session productively today if we get off track. And so if that's not really relevant or helpful, or if it's just sort of a personal remark that's not about the issues, then I appreciate why it's important to you, but I don't think it will help to dwell on that today. And so that's sometimes how I try to move past it and try to get them to see the bigger picture.
I think you're right. I think people show up, whether it's a mental health diagnosis or any other preconceived decision they've made after dealing with this other person for X amount of time. I think that's just standard. They have made a set of decisions about this person either being an idiot or this person being a mean, spiteful person, or they're a narcissist, or and half the time, of course, like most of us, we don't know what those words actually mean. And I think that's a broad category of how you get that individual to participate toward finding a resolution rather than spending their time trying to validate their judgment/diagnosis. And personally, the way I deal with that most often is I grant them their diagnosis right off the bat. I say, well, let's just assume that they're a narcissist for the moment. I don't know, I'm not a clinician, so I can't tell you if it's true or not. But let's just assume they are. So how do you want to work with this to try and find a way to get something that they'll agree to that works for you? Let's assume they're a narcissist. Let's assume they're a spiteful person for the moment. What do you think? And then they start kind of unpacking the direction forward. Instead of what they're looking for is validation. They want you to say, yeah, man, that person is holy Toledo, right? They're looking for you to say that so that they'll feel right, they'll feel good. And of course, if you go there, of course, that's just a dangerous game to ever do, because it skews everything. So I just do the hypothetical and say, let's just treat it like that for a while and see and talk about how we get where we need to go.
It's a great approach. And so you're acknowledging them, you're respecting and valuing them and their need to be to have that judgment, and you are lightening it up and moving it along without
And
giving
the
it any weight.
fact is, they've dealt with this other person way longer than we have.
Yeah, right.
So I am never in the business of contradicting. The story about this guy I told you earlier, what was really ironic, what I said to him was, well, you know, near as I don't probably disagree that the 4 people who have accused you of very serious harassment, my guess is they would like to see you gone. That would just be a guess. And it's not an unintelligent guess. I said, now, there's probably a lot of other outcomes that'll work for them, too. If what they perceived as harassment completely stopped, my guess is they'd be happy to work with you. But the minute, and I think you guys said, the minute you start trying to contradict or you start trying to change their view of that impose something a little different, even marginally different, all you do is bed that back in. And to me, up until you hit real capacity issues where someone starts, talking to people who aren't there for advice, and then you've got a different set of questions around informed consent, around capacity, then that has to kick in. But I think the harder ones are when we get these subclinical diagnoses and lay people, opinions about each other that whether there's true mental illness there or not is almost the same problem.
Yeah.
Well, and I just want to say that when we think about mental health on a continuum, the reality is both sides are going to be struggling, because even if the person that's so-called identified as the one with mental illness, the person who's been dealing with that person is going to have had an impact on their mental health. So the same strategies that we might use for the person that has been identified as having a problem, I think are really important to have that same respect and validation and non-challenging, non-judgmental attitude towards the other party, because their reality and how they're communicating it to us is it's their reality. And I liked what Lisa said about really trying to help them focus on the goal, because that's where they need to go in that context.
Right, yeah. I want to ask one more question before we move on to actually the point that you've just raised about how it affects professionals, because this management of an understanding and consciousness about around dealing with people with different challenges actually has an effect on us professionally. But before that, I just want to put it to all of you: is there anything else that we haven't talked about? There was we talked briefly about ethical responsibility, but is there anything more you want to say about the ethical responsibility that we professionals have in working with mental health issues? Anything that we didn't touch on?
I mean, there's a lot to discuss, but one of the pieces, and to sort of tie it into the other question about issues that can present, I've definitely noticed a trend of people with certain types of mental health issues being very, very chatty. And I don't know if that's an element of the phone, but it's across from dementia to all kinds, but it's a theme I have noticed. And as a professional who bills by the hour, and if you're a mediator billing by the hour, I feel an ethical responsibility to try to manage that, because I could sit on the phone and not say a word for 45 minutes with some people. Some of them are lonely, some of them need to vent, and it's not right for me to take advantage of that. And so that's where I think there's an ethical responsibility. And I've developed some phrases that I use to try to shut down the conversation when it's reached its sort of what should be the natural ending. I wrote a few down, actually, because it's a skill that I've had to develop. I have spent many evenings at the office because I haven't been able to hang up the phone, or I put my headset in and I'm driving, and sometimes it's become a game, how long can I go without making a noise? But I've just realized it takes too much of my time, and so some of the sort of respectful ways I've found, and I'll say, well, I'm sorry to have taken up so much of your time.
Good one.
Sometimes I say I have a caller meeting, and sometimes I truly schedule my calls before a caller meeting so that it's forcing me to have boundaries because I have now a client in reception. I'm going to stop you there because I know we have a lot to cover and I want to use our time effectively. That has worked pretty well. Sometimes I remind the client that they've already told me that story. That has been helpful because sometimes people say, you're right, I talk to so many people I forget who knows what. And sometimes I say, thank you so much, and I summarize next steps. And I think if you're in a mediation context, you could also use tools like an agenda. If you do allocate time for opening statements, for example, to put some time constraints, I think those are some tools to kind of help move the process forward and hopefully give the person enough time to say what they need. And maybe they do need more time to say it, but also not take advantage of the clock and ability to make profit because they take a long time, and also respecting everyone else in the room's time as well, because that needs to be balanced.
It's a great point, Lisa. Thank you. And those are really great strategies and comments.
Just on ethics, just one other thing, and this one I have no answer to, but there are times, especially in workplace, where one party clearly presents as living in a bit of an alternate view of the world quite substantially. The mediation fails because of that, and there's certainly a strong desire on my part to somehow let the organization know that they should be doing what they can to help this because it's an issue. And it's usually a case where the individual doesn't have that insight. And there's really no, I don't have a good answer to it, right? Sometimes I talk with the company representative and I just say something along the lines of, there may be other issues at play here, more individual issues for at least one of the parties, that as an organization, if there's any other resources or approaches you can take, it might help. And generally they know the parties enough to probably know who I'm talking about, and they probably have reached something of a similar conclusion, and I'm just reinforcing it a little bit, but it's real close to the line.
Right. Okay, great. All right, so I'd like to move on to a next piece and look at how this actually affects us, because whether you're a caregiver or whether you're at the mediation table or a lawyer or dealing with any emotional issues that require a lot of consciousness in managing them effectively, it affects us. It affects us, and especially if we work in this context on a regular, continual, consistent basis. So I'm going to put it to my panel, beginning with Jared, who has had a lot to say about vicarious trauma.
Yeah, so vicarious trauma, it's sort of defined as that trauma that we experience as workers or helpers, which results from our own empathic engagement with traumatized clients. I would also put in there our sort of constant exposure to toxic emotions, conflict, and just traumatic narrative. It is a chronic buildup. I think as professionals, we hear something and we move on from it. Some of us take it home with us, some of us don't. Some of us are resilient in dealing with those things. Others dwell on it a bit more. But it's not, you don't find that it's sort of an acute issue where it's, you hear a bad story and it gives you burnout. The burnout comes over time. It is this constant exposure, this buildup. For me, I think the big thing, in beyond just the burnout, is the compassion fatigue. Over time, of course, I think for a lot of us, it gets harder and harder to empathically engage, to stay present, to stay focused, to express any type of compassion. And certainly where there are issues of mental health, this is clearly a problem. If we're unable to stick with our clients and be present with their narratives and respect their narratives, and we just, get frustrated and burnt out when we discredit them, obviously the process is compromised, and they're not able to participate and feel the respect that they deserve in that process. For me, I think much of the professional, when we talk about ethics, I think ethically as a professional, we have to practice a degree of self-reflexivity. I think we constantly have to challenge our understandings of things like mental health, challenge our biases, but also sort of reflect on how we are impacted and be sort of, realistic with ourselves and acknowledge when, I'm not doing my work right now. I'm checked out, or I am angry. Why am I so angry with the people who are sitting at this table? Why am I not able to give them the attention that they need? Am I being just overly directive for the wrong reasons? So part of that is a professional responsibility to monitor oneself. In talking with a lot of professionals, and I think this is probably the same in a lot of professions, is that people are pretty bad at self-care and self-monitoring. People work long hours, they don't care very well for themselves, their diet, their mental state, all of that. So in dealing with this issue, I think there is a responsibility to practice self-care. That also requires that professionals know the limits in terms of how much work they can take on, the types of cases they can take. Do they actually believe that they can handle this case based on what they know about it? So I think there are responsibilities there. I think in terms of managing it, professionals also need to ensure that there are very strong boundaries. Certainly in the family context, I'm a parenting coordinator, and people they find ways to contact you all day long. They send you emails at night, they call you, they find your home number somehow, and the only reason they call you is with an issue. So again, this goes back to every time you're talking with someone, a client, it's a toxic situation. So boundaries, and looking after yourself, because if yourself sort of dealing with stress and issues and your own sort of mental wellness things, and as I said, I think we all do that, we're on that spectrum, then, we're as I said, we're fatigued and we're checked out. So.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Jared. That was something we all need to hear. Thank you.
I'm happy to follow up on that. So I totally agree with everything that Jared has said, and I also find it really difficult and find myself having compassion fatigue at times. And I can give you an example. I had booked a week off this summer in July, and the day before I was to leave to go away with my kids for a few days, I got a new client. And the client was very sympathetic and was clearly suffering and under extreme stress and had suffered trauma and was now charged with a very serious offense and had her children taken away. And I spent my entire week of my vacation from where I was remotely working on the case. And I really regret doing that. I lost a week of spending time with my kids and not being stressed. And I think that it's something that happens that is hard to control, because I do really care about my clients. I cared about this case. It was an extremely stressful time for the client. But at some point, you have to put yourself first, because how are you ever going to recover and relax and have the downtime that you need to be the best professional you can be? And so I do find it hard to impose those boundaries myself, and it's something that is a continuous struggle going forward in the profession. And I think that if you don't do it, you can really reach a point where you're just unable to perform at your best. So it's something that we have to work towards and really keep in mind that we're not going to be able to be the best we can be for our clients if we don't take that time.
Great. That's a great anecdote. Thank you.
I think advocates have this much worse than we do as mediators. Because I think you have clients for longer periods of time. You get one side for a long period of time. You have advocacy goals for these clients that may, especially with mental illness, may not be, as you said earlier, Jessyca, achievable. And you have to steward that through the process to an end that is going to be unsatisfying no matter how you slice it. I think in a sense as mediators we get people a little bit less periods of time, and we're there to try in a short period of time to try and solve a problem that either will or won't, and certainly some that don't resolve haunt me for periods of time thereafter. That certainly happens. For me as a mediator, I find it one of the great paradoxes around not so much compassion fatigue, but that connecting on the empathetic level. I think it's paradoxical because the hard part is being deeply empathetic regularly, but the way out of the box is being deeply empathetic regularly. It's both. And the closer I can stay and work with that person, the easier it is to, whatever the outcome is, to let it go. And then on the other side is that, pick a number, 70, 80, 90% of the time, you reach a resolution and they walk away feeling better. Mm-hmm. And vicariously you feel better.
Right.
So we get that out of it as well.
So you're building capacity, it's what you're talking about.
Yeah,
our ability.
but that said, that doesn't change anything, Jared, that you referred to. And I guess as a last resort, I just sink into denial.
Always a great strategy.
It's a happy place. Yeah.
Lisa, anything you want to add to that?
Sure. So, yeah, the empathy part I thought would be my greatest weakness when I started my practice a few years ago in family health law. I did, Myers-Briggs and those kinds of things, and thinking about my own strengths and weaknesses, and I actually thought in many ways it would be my biggest weakness. Somehow I've been able to separate better than I anticipated, but as a health lawyer, what I do, my clients are dealing with end-of-life situations, really, really challenging health situations all the time. So one of the things that I find very helpful, I'm very lucky my husband is a paramedic. So he actually has the same sort of dilemmas that I do of having to see some very difficult things and thinking about taking that home with him. And he's very aware of PTSD. A number of his colleagues have post-traumatic stress disorder. He's done peer support counseling, so I've learned from him as well. And one of the things I've learned is everybody does cope differently. So for some people, talking about what they experienced is helpful, but for other people, it's worse. Things that he commented on is, in his field, the follow-up was happening a few weeks later. People were moving on, and then they had to relive. I found sometimes, and so for some medics, actually, he works as an acting supervisor. Some medics, they see a situation the day. Others want to stay on the road and stay busy. And so there isn't necessarily one right way out what works for you. And so some situations I do find I like to talk about. Others I just would rather. The other thing I find that's helpful is giving my clients resources. I'm not a social worker, I'm not a therapist, and I'm often mindful. The relationship starts to feel like it's going there, and I need to put the boundaries up. So I do direct people. A lot of my clients who are family caregivers, I give them information about support groups for family caregivers, especially in the mental health setting. There are support groups. That's what they do, is they provide support to the family. So I'll try to find locations where I know they're meeting close to my clients, and I try to at least point them in the direction of people that are the professionals to help them rather than taking it on myself. I have a client, she was on the verge of homelessness recently, and I wanted to offer her my home, and of course that would not be appropriate. So tried to figure out social workers and other professionals, agencies that can at least take it from there and not put the whole burden on my shoulders, and try to recognize what the boundaries are as a lawyer.
Right. Okay. So boundaries, and self-care, 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 right? Those are 6 strategies, right? All right. So moving to our final strategy piece, and I see we're 15 minutes now, so I can't, so maybe you can, for each of you, if you can summarize in maybe 3 or 4 minutes what your key strategies are moving forward and I'd say in 2 ways. One is to create safe spaces. How do you create safe spaces, both in your client contacts and at the mediation table? And also how your strategies for de-escalating a situation. Lisa, your strategies for how you shut down a call were great. So when there is a situation that is becoming increasingly high conflict, how you de-escalate. So those would be two different kinds of strategies that I invite you to talk about. Beginning with Jess.
Sure. So just to pick up on the de-escalating and stressful situations, I find that when we're all at the table, we've brought all the parties together. It wasn't easy to find a date. It wasn't easy to get there. But now you have a party, whether it's your client or the other side, that is clearly in distress. I think we have to ask ourselves whether or not it's time to adjourn, whether it's time to take a break, and everyone's going to go away for an hour or so and have lunch, or it's time to come back on a different day. And no one likes to do that because it costs money and it's stressful and people are angry because they wanted things to be resolved, they wanted to have a conclusion. But sometimes it's just not going to happen that day. And as you've heard on the panel today, people's mental health status can fluctuate, whether they are mentally well or mentally unwell. They can decompensate as a result of the stress of this event, or they're just having a bad day, or they didn't take their medication, or whatever the case may be. It just may not be the day for that to happen. And that is a strategy that I use at times where I see things are starting to get out of control. I suggest we come back on a different day. And for the most part, that does work for me. I've had a lot of success using that as a strategy. And so with respect to moving on to the other issue of creating safe space, one of the things that I always try to do is give the client a better understanding of what is expected of them and what I anticipate is going to happen. And you can use that whether you're going to mediation, you're having a meeting at your office, you're going to court. No matter what is happening, I try to talk to them on the phone and say, I understand that this is going to be stressful for you. I can hear that you're feeling anxious, and I hear it in your voice that you're feeling upset right now. So I want to just take you back a couple of steps and explain to you how this is going to go so you understand who the players are, where we'll be. We'll have time to talk in private. If you have things that you need to ask me, we'll be able to go into this room and talk about this. And I try to create for them an understanding that gives them back some aspect of control over the process, because this whole experience feels like they're losing control and they don't have any voice. And so I try to give them back that power, even if it's only on in a minimal way. Just try to engage them in the process and make sure that they understand what's expected of them. And just as a very quick story about that is I have a client who's got some issues, and he likes to bring his iguana with him. And so, I make sure that I say to this client, you can't bring your pets. And for him, he likes to bring his pet iguana everywhere. But I'm like, no, you can't. I just want to make sure you understand what's expected of you. No iguanas at the courthouse.
But you can bring a picture of your iguana.
Right.
And my last strategy is just asking the person if they need to have a support person there with them. That is something that I've also found is really helpful. So a lot of my clients have a case manager or a mental health worker or someone in the community that they're working with that supports them. And they help them remember things and understand things when they can't process the information. And so I ask them if they want to bring that person with them, and then I say, do I have your consent to talk about your case with this person? Yes, you do. They almost always say yes. Right. And I found that to be a really great strategy that helps decompress and sort of make them feel more comfortable and engage them even more.
Great strategies. And yeah, with remembering to ask consent from the caregiver. Yeah, it's great strategies. Thank you. Jared.
So when we talk about safe space, certainly in the family context, much of that is sort of worked on from the outset of our intake. We do substantial intakes. We often do a lot of pre-mediation work as well. So where we have indicators of mental health issues, we want to make sure that we do a really good process design to sort of compensate for that. Many times we'll want to make sure that they have resources, that they're connected to resources. If someone comes in and they're presenting as having depression-like symptoms, or if they've disclosed self-harming behaviors, we want to make sure that they've got resources in place so that when they do come into the mediation, that the stress of that isn't in fact a triggering event for them. So we want to make sure there's a lot of security around our process. Once we're actually engaged in the process, we do, where there are sort of capacity issues or issues, sometimes other mental health issues, we will, do things like shuttle mediation, of course, and make sure that parties are comfortable. If there's a lot of anxiety with the other person in the room, or, traumatic events in their relationship past, we set up the structure so people are sort of safe and comfortable, and they're not sort of overwhelmed by it. Lots of things, that we do are around tempo control. Again, as I mentioned, sort of working memory and people's ability to sit in stressful situations. So it's just an ongoing sort of assessment of a person's needs and how they're engaging in that, and not just sort of abandoning your assessment and process design at the outset. It's ever evolving, certainly in our context. When we talk about de-escalating issues and dealing with sort of anger and those sort of big emotions at the table, I always tend to go back to language and interaction and engagement. So the two things I often draw from, you may be familiar with Bill Eddy and his EAR approach, so empathy, attention, and respect, which, is in itself, it's similar to a lot of other approaches, and it's very basic, but it's sort of universal. I also go through a lot of motivational interviewing techniques, which are quite similar in terms of avoiding argumentation, sort of reducing blame, expressing empathy. So, it's simply a matter of connecting, acknowledging, respecting, and then refocusing back onto the task at hand. If that in itself doesn't work, then we break, and we use strategies to change it and disengage the parties, and then once they're able to, and then just come back into the mediation.
Okay, thank you. Lisa?
So a few other tips for creating a safe space. Previously we heard about not labeling people with their diagnosis, but I would also say not using those words as adjectives. People will say something is schizophrenic to mean disorganized. Those kinds of words used in that way do not create a safe space. Or using terms flippantly. I'm so OCD about this, and to some people, they're not actually, they don't have that disorder. It's a real disorder. People go to the hospital for it. People are medicated, and we use those terms so casually sometimes it really takes away from the seriousness of a person suffering anxiety. This happens a lot as well. Someone who really truly suffers from anxiety disorder, that's not the same as me just feeling anxious about something. We all feel stressed and anxious at times. So I think being mindful globally of our language is helpful. Another thing can be using an intake process to canvass what people's needs are. Back when I was at the University of Guelph, I was a resident assistant, and I remember I gave my students a form at the beginning of the year, an open-ended, is there anything else that I might need to know to be a good RA for you this year, such as health issues? And lo and behold, one was prone to fainting, one had PTSD, one had OCD. And I was able to, the fainting one, I was just glad that if something happens, I would have panicked less. But the other ones, I was able to be there as in a supportive role during the year, and they felt comfortable when they were struggling. And actually, my student that did have OCD, he once went missing for a few days, and I knew to take it more seriously because the stress of the academic year may have gotten to him, and I was very worried. And I may have otherwise thought he just went home for a few days rather than taking it seriously. So if you have an intake process, you don't have to specifically mention mental health, but if you canvass, what else can I do to make this a more comfortable process? I have clients, they need to interrupt meetings to take injections. Women sometimes need to disappear and pump, and they don't feel comfortable saying, I need to go pump breast milk in the bathroom for 20 minutes. But if you create an atmosphere where people maybe don't have to reveal specifics, but can discuss in advance if they might need breaks or other accommodations, make that atmosphere known from the beginning, in a non-judgmental way that encourages people to say what they need. That can help some people come forward. And also, you don't need to probe. If they can tell you what accommodation they need, you don't necessarily need to know the backstory anyways, and that makes it a less invasive conversation.
Great strategy. It's really great. Thank you, Lisa. Gary.
Good. So a lot of this has been said, and I agree with a lot of that. Some just quickly, some technical things. If you have representatives, work with the representatives offline, talk to them. They have often greater insight into what's going on, or at least more information, so that's very, very useful. As much, just even to echo what Jared said, whether there's mental health issues there or not, every single person is motivated by something. And that, to me, is getting as close to that as you can in a respectful way, which is why empathy and respect go a long way, is getting as close to that as you can, and exploring it is critical. And so sometimes at high stress especially is just suggest the opposite. So that's why, to me, if they're stressed and really freaking out, it's maybe we need to stop. Maybe you don't need or want an agreement today. And I don't say that as a recommendation. I say it, what do you think? And you will tell from the reaction very quickly whether that reduces stress or increases the stress or takes it in a different direction. But exploring something other than what we're focused on now often gives you huge amounts of information, but it has to be done in a strongly empathetic, respectful way that you're walking this beside them. And in those cases, similar to what you suggested, Lisa, you asked, if they had health issues. Once they've shared that, they work with you on it, right? And so it's similar there. If they feel you're walking with them, people will start to share what they're really trying to accomplish. And once they keep connecting back to that, it has a hugely de-escalating effect. Last thing, just a real technical one. The Canadian Mental Health Association has a fabulous website. They have language on there, how to talk about these issues, literally scripts, words, phrases that just can be really helpful if this is relatively new and you're not familiar with it, and it can really give you some great tools.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, thank you for that CMHA reference, because it's very helpful. But I really love your phrase, Gary, that when disputants or parties feel that we are walking with them, that makes such a huge difference. And walking with them instead of being there or not has everything to do with these strategies that we've talked about here.
Yeah, I mean, I've had one person, we went through this, and at one point they looked at me and said, "Look, I know I'm crazy." Mm-hmm. I know, and I said, "Well, personally, I don't think that at all." But they got that there was other things going on, and they would never say that until, like we said, if it's not a safe space, you get all these other strategies going on. Yeah.
Safe space. All right, thank you. Thank you. So the big hand is almost at the 12. We have another 1 minute for questions. Yes.
This is about framing. This is about, the word suffer has come up a couple of times. Suffer means to permit, to allow, to endure. It's not a good word to use in this relationship. It's really not. One experiences mental illness, or one experiences, say, schizophrenia. One does not suffer from it. And that's really, this is
right.
CMHA, and we have to really frame the relationship differently. And this is a way, starting now is the language. It goes from there up. Read Madness and Civilization by Phil
Great.
He'll make you all mad too.
But you make a really, really great point about language, and we all have to be, and I'm just going to end on that note because that's a really powerful note to end on, is the importance of all of us to be really mindful of all the words that come out of our mouth, how we frame things, how we, the language that we use. I know Lisa talked a lot about not using words flippantly. I'm also OCD, I'm this, I'm that, he's narcissistic, whatever it is. Just be really aware that people hear things in ways that we don't know. And so we certainly don't want to exacerbate any situation. of discomfort. We want to make it as safe as possible. And one of the ways of creating safe spaces so that we de-escalate our stress and the stress level and anxieties of our parties is to make them feel that we hear them, we're not judging them, they can divulge, they can share, and that we are walking with them. That's such a great phrase, that we are walking with them. And on that note, I really thank you for your ear. This is such an important topic for all of us, and I really appreciate that you've taken the time today to come and be with us today. So thank you very much. Thank you.